Good morning, friends. Welcome home. Glad you're here. Every time you start an event in the evening, you always wonder if people are going to come back. It's nice to see you. As we've gathered together, I mean, it is kind of fun to come back into your own territory and to see faces that you know and to talk to people and catch up. And Steve Morton stopped by and I realized I was saying hello to him this morning because I didn't say hello to him last night because he wasn't here. So the first rule is don't tell Steve anything we did last night. All right, let him catch up and we'll go from there. Today we're going to pick up the same conversation. We're going to try to move ahead and we're going to particularly focus on outcomes. I was trying to offer a kind of a justification of why that's so important last night, but we're also going to blend in leadership. And let me say that the leadership that I understand in today's culture is not the leadership that I have been trained in. I've never thought of the banana kind of metaphor before, but it's very much to the point of what we're talking about here. Where we're going to go today is that essentially I will argue that you and I can no longer manage change. You just can't lead change anymore because the banana ripens much too fast. And so we're going to talk about a less linear form of leadership. And so we're going to talk about a less linear form of planning. I mean, the whole issue around outcomes is not the idea that you're going to come up with the master plan with the brilliant idea, you're going to go back and convince others and you're going to put it on and come up with action plans. Friends, I was taught that way, and when you have a problem, when you're looking at technical information, that works well. And 90% of what you deal with is not technical. It is not a problem. And so we have to learn new ways of thinking and new ways of looking at our leadership as we go along. So today what I'd like to talk about is clarity, purpose, and the reason to be in church. We picked up this a little bit last night. We have been on a remarkable path. Oh, by the way, don't forget the standing rule. This is, whenever we're in these kinds of settings, it takes a lot from us. The coffee's over there. Don't forget the coffee. If you hear the coffee calling, take care of yourself. You know where the restrooms are. We'll take a break around 10:30 or so. I'm going to slip out at 10 o'clock and invite the Bible study folk over to our group. All right? But we have been on this path, and this path is one in which we have been learning a lot. 1965 was the first year that for us as United Methodists, we had a net loss in membership. It was an anomaly. It took us by surprise. That's 50 years ago. And in fact, the response of the church, if I were to think about how the church responded at that time, it was simple curiosity. Oh, look at that. That's different. And so we looked at the next year and the next year and the next year. And it was a lot like the conversations in the early stages of climate change. You know, what's the data tell us? Is this really just a little anomaly? Is there a little blip going? Is it self-correcting cycle? What's happening? We waited, and if you will, our 50 years in the wilderness is because we waited for about 10 to figure out that something was actually happening. And so our curiosity, by the time we got into the 70s, our curiosity had turned to fixing things. We immediately wanted to fix things, and that's a natural reaction of any system. You know, we're suddenly realizing things are not going the way they used to. We have to do something. We set ourselves to fixing clergy and congregations as if they were broken. And in many ways, I think we did a disservice to an awful lot of people. Now, it wasn't an intentional disservice. We were learning how to live in this new land. And so the first thing we needed to do was try to fix things. You all are getting CEUs, I think, for what you're doing here. Is that right? Okay, if you need more CEUs, tell me, I'll talk slower, you know? But, that was at the end, on the onset, that was us trying to say, if only we had better clergy, people would come. And then we started to talk about congregations, that whole church growth. Now don't minimize what we learned from the church growth efforts, because it has taught us so many things. Among other things, it taught us that if you want to do ministry with young families and you have a nursery, you probably ought to tell people where the nursery is. I literally worked with a Presbyterian church in Upper New Jersey one time that was dumbfounded that it would be a good idea to unlock their front door on Sunday morning. Because everybody knew how to come in the back. So we had very fundamental, basic things that we had to learn, and we did learn them. But we discovered that by making better clergy and by making more efficient congregations, we still weren't making progress in the wilderness. We were making progress with the people who were already in our congregations, but not in the wilderness. And so the fix-it mode also has had to shift. And so that's why at this point we're really talking about the identity and purpose. I said last night that our church around 1996 took another hard look at itself and said, this really is not about not fixing something as if it's broken. This is us having to remember who we are and why we are. For what purpose has God called us to this moment? Now, we've tried to do that generically. We've tried to do that wholesale. One of the dilemmas is that this kind of work is always contextual, and it will always have to be immediate to the context in which you live. So we're back to where we started last night. Nobody can tell you how to do your ministry, but there are different ways for us to think about it. Well, this invitation, financial leadership, the two are very, very much interchanged in my mind. If you go back to last night, the whole idea that a lot of us were born into a culture that had a group identity. And so we learned to talk to people as if they were always a group. And so we talked about stewardship. And stewardship to the GI generation is an issue of fairness. If I'm on this team, am I paying my fair share? If I'm on this team, am I being loyal to my church with my prayers, my presence, my gifts, and my service? Am I putting in the right amount? Is my duty being met? And so people were responding as if they were part of a group, and we were actually trying to lay, if you will, standards for people's behavior that would identify them as either being good or bad people. I did a... Oh, okay, go ahead.
I would challenge that. I think it's a theological question that the tithe is a tithe for that generation and for all of us who...
Yeah, okay. Tim, I'm not going to argue that a tithe is not a tithe. What I'm saying is that the way you talk about that tithe is heard differently in different people's ears.
Well, I can tell you my parents don't think of it differently.
No, I'm sure. I would suggest that your parents are of that generation that really subscribed to the interpretation of the tithe as a fair share along...
No.
Okay, hang on, Tim.
Theological.
Okay, no, I'll accept that. I'll accept that. I don't really need to argue it, but I will accept the fact that there is a theology behind this. But the theology also will go to younger people who no longer want to talk about stewardship, they want to talk about generosity. And the generosity is similarly trying to respond to the same claim that God has on our lives, but it's framed in a really different way because they don't see themselves as a group, they see themselves as individuals, and as an individual, they are determined that they want to be able to direct themselves and their gifts to something that will make a difference. And quite frankly, whatever the theology has been for people, formerly, people would subscribe to a tithe or to stewardship as a way of supporting the church. Today, that gets reframed in terms of supporting values and issues important to the person's life. And so we have to learn how to talk across these generations, because both groups are still in our congregations. And we have to be at least aware that our territory is shifting as we do this. And so I've been making the argument that we really need to pay attention to the primacy of identity and purpose, where once people used to talk about their congregation as the seat of the place in which they would encounter God. Today, people are willing to explore to find God in different places. And they will resonate, they will drift to those places where their spirit is being fed, where it's being met. And so identity and purpose is one of the ways in which we have that conversation with people. And so, as I was saying, even though I wrote a book on metrics, one of the primary discoveries that came out of that is that it really isn't about the metrics at all. It's about the outcomes. That we really need to be able to tell people what those outcomes are. If we can't tell people, if we can't tell others the purpose of our gathering in our communities, what reason do they actually have to be with us? This has not been an easy conversation. I mentioned it yesterday, last night, talking about even identity is a hard question, because we tend to think about who we were rather than who we are. Our congregations know more about who they were than about who they are right now. And one of the reasons that these kinds of conversations are so difficult for established congregations is because it's hard to sustain a question that people think they already have the answer to. Because you'll ask people, who are we? And boy, they'll tell you just like that. And then they want to move on. As a matter of fact, when Alice Mann and I were at Albany, we worked on the book of Holy Conversations, which was really trying to take a look at strategic planning from a position of discernment of the call of God. We started out with three fundamental questions. Who are we? The identity question. What has God called us to be, to do? That's the purpose question. And then who is our neighbor? The context question. Where are we here? It wasn't too long that we learned we had to ask those questions differently. We had to ask the question, who are we now? What has God called us to now? Who is our neighbor now? Because we stay stuck in what we know, and we are not sensitive to what shifts around us. There is a dilemma when we get into this, that again, we really can't do this with logic and linear leadership. Where we're going to go today is the importance of conversation. I deeply subscribe to the idea that one of the fundamental tasks of leadership is to give the people a better conversation to have. I subscribe to the idea that leadership is giving people a better story to live. I subscribe to the idea that leadership is giving people a real future to worry about instead of a past. And all of that happens very much through conversation. Well, there's two issues that make, that at least I want to start with here, that make outcomes difficult. One is that we are an aspirational people. Do you realize that you were called into ministry because you had a conviction that there was something more that God was asking you to address than the daily life that you were going about? I was called into ministry back into the 60s because I truly believed that being a Christian meant that you could live a life that was of deeper meaning and value than if you didn't. And I also believed that the church was going to change the world. Now, this was back in the days of civil rights and the Vietnam War, and the church was very, very active and very, very out front in terms of its positions. And I just knew that the church was going to change the world, and I deeply wanted to be a part of that. Do you hear what that's all about? I aspired to connect myself to something that was far beyond what I could ever understand or manage by myself. And so I went off to seminary, where they taught me to be aspirational. They taught me that this wasn't just a better world, this was the coming of the kingdom of God. So my little aspiration got to be a big aspiration. And I was trained to think aspirationally. Preaching and the proclamation was the offering of the bigger picture to people. How are we doing? Does this make sense? That's a good thing. That's deeply a good thing. But the problem with aspirations is that you can't act directly on them. Knowing that you're part of wanting to bring the kingdom of God and that the kingdom of God will come. I used to have an Episcopal priest friend who would say, Gil, you only have one choice. Either the Spirit is going to work through you or around you. So we know it's going to come. But the fact that we know it's going to come doesn't instruct us in terms of what we should be working on tomorrow in order to get there. And being an aspirational people does not offer a lot of direction in terms of how we can take steps toward that which God has called us to do. I've been saying that, one of the issues is that you and I are trained to be linear thinkers. And as linear thinkers, we tend to think from left to right. And so if we were to think about the present and the future, one of the things that we would say is that here's the present, here's the future. And the normative approach, particularly as the culture has been relatively settled in our younger years, is to think that our future is going to be pretty similar to our present, except if all goes well, a little bit better. And so we would do our strategic planning in terms of, well, this is what we did last year. What do you want to do next year? And so it was a linear way of thinking about things. How are we doing? Make sense? I should say something about that. You're going to hear me say that a lot today. How are we doing? Does that make sense? Let me say that I am, in terms of Myers-Briggs, an INTJ. I am an archetypal INTJ. I cannot be more INTJ until they make up more questions. And one of the ways I explain that is that when I took the Myers-Briggs, I got them right the first time. Well, what INTJs do is that they live inside their heads. They're in love with ideas. Because ideas are a way of framing the world to help you know where you are. And I will play with ideas, and I'm going to do that, all day with you. I always try to assure people that I do understand feelings because my wife has explained them a couple of times, and I'm good there. But an INTJ is always going to ask you, how are we doing? Does that make sense? Because friends, we're trying to shape a shared conversation here. So if it makes sense, then the normative response would be, yes, Gil. And then I just keep going. If it doesn't make sense, jump in, friends. This is your conversation. Okay, we need to be together on this. And so if it's not making sense, please jump in and help us to deepen it. So what I was trying to say here is that in terms of, the dilemma with aspirations is that we always think about ourselves in this linear mode. The reality in our church is that we are not in a linear mode. We are in an unsustainable mode. You all know this, and some of you are in congregations that are very sustainable. In terms of the norm across all of our congregations, that is not the case. And as a denomination, we are not sustainable. If you take a look at all of our data, essentially it comes down to a formula. Right now we are living off more and more money that is given by fewer and fewer people who are getting older and older. By definition, that is not sustainable. Yes. All right. Don't go for the easy stuff, Byron. Hang in for the, all right? I mean, we knew that. And so, And so the natural response is to get aspirational. We don't want this. What we want is this. How we doing? We okay? We want to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. That's us saying, no, we don't want the unsustainable future, we want the missional future. And that actually was a key corner for our denomination to turn. But the dilemma is that, and this is often known as gap theory in terms of organizational work, the dilemma is it is common that you can't get there from here. Goes back to what we were saying last night. We're supposed to be making disciples. Nobody ever told me about making disciples. It's foreign for me. I have to rethink it. I have to reconsider. I have to consider whether or not I even have sufficient discipleship practices in my own life. I have to consider, what does it mean if I'm supposed to make disciples and I have a congregation that has no sense of discipleship themselves? Sometimes you can't get there from here. And so if the only thing you have is an aspiration, and the only thing you're willing to work with is an aspiration, organizationally, that is an example of work avoidance. If the only thing you're willing to talk about are aspirations, it is an indication that you're not willing to do the work to move toward it. There's a remarkable book called Surplus Powerlessness, which is the reflections of Michael Lerner, who was very much involved with the social justice movement in the 60s. He would often say that, you know, the people who were trying to bring deep change to the American culture at that point often planned most of their tactics to fail. They designed them to fail because of the deep satisfaction that came from losing. If your aspiration is so large that you're going to introduce social justice and you're going to introduce, you know, kind of unity across a whole country and you're going to bring a whole nation to the end of a war, that is an aspiration too large. And so what you do is you just throw yourself against it, and as you lose, you say, look how big our dream was. We are brave people. The reality is it kept them from doing the hard work to bring the kind of social change that would actually undergird and support any of the change that they described. Does that make sense? Yeah. If the only thing you and I are willing to do is be aspirational, we're actually not doing our work.
Book of James.
Book of James. Yeah, really, there are places where, I mean, we knew this before. We knew this before. And so what a lot of us have been doing is to say that our real work is not out there. Our work is back here in what are called proximate outcomes. For most of it, it's not a matter of trying to bring the kingdom of God. It's a matter of how do I take my community, how do I take myself, how do I relate to others so that we can take one step closer toward the kingdom of God. The image that I used frequently when I was working with annual conferences that were struggling with many of these kinds of questions was just a little story about a mother who on a very, very dark night out on the farm turned to her young son and said, go on out and make sure that the barn door is locked. So the little boy walked out and he came back inside in 1 minute. And she said, what's wrong? And he said, well, it's too dark, I can't see the barn. She said, no problem, here, take the flashlight. So he went out the door with the flashlight, he came back in 1 minute. And she said, well, what's wrong now? And he said, well, the flashlight's not strong enough. I still can't see the barn. She said, you don't need to see the barn. Just walk to the end of the light. And you know what happens when you walk to the end of the light? You see the next part of the path. And if you walk to the end of the light, you see the next part of the path. And the only thing you need to know is that generally the barn is out there in that basic direction. If we start taking steps, we will find ourselves moving closer and closer to that which we have called. But friends, it's all about our willingness to do the hard work to figure out what are the steps along the way. And that's part of what I'm talking about in terms of the shift of leadership. The leadership that I was taught was that the pastor, as leader of a congregation, was supposed to come up with the vision and cast the vision. And everyone would then follow, or you would learn how to begin to help people invest in it so that they would begin to work with you on it. But it was all about you coming up with the destination. Does that sound familiar?
Yes.
Can I mention it doesn't work?
Yes, Gil.
Yeah. And it doesn't. Because in some sense, we've been trained not to come up with a vision, but we've been trained to come up with an answer. And an answer quite often is an answer to the problem or to the anxiety that people are feeling. And so we have become problem solvers for the church, not leaders for the gospel. Yes, ma'am.
When you say cast the vision doesn't work, are you saying because people don't know how to cast a vision, because they're looking for an answer versus vision, that's why it doesn't work?
Actually, one of the reasons I'm saying that the vision doesn't work, at least in terms of the way that a lot of the literature would talk about it earlier on, and we're going back now 10, 15 years, is that essentially visions were to be developed primarily by the leader or leaders. And so this was set up so that you were supposed to know more than anybody else. And you were supposed to bring wisdom that nobody else could find. That's not how communities work. And as a matter of fact, there's an awful lot of literature out there in corporate America where that doesn't work as well. And so all I'm trying to say is that the responsibility of discerning where the vision came from was put in the wrong spot. And we were supposed to implement them. It looks like you wanted to say something else.
Yeah, because I think
I'm sorry.
I think the statement that you said was such a blanket statement that it excludes things where there are actual, authentic visions, where people are living into those visions. But I agree with what you just said about the vision in the wrong place, and that's the wrong source. But, just considering, that we are still a church, and that I would hope that a leader would be divinely inspired to the extent that we're going for the kingdom of God, that the Holy Spirit would be playing some part of that vision, not just somebody's calculated, goal.
Yeah.
I agree in that context.
Sure. And in fact, I do want to come back today and talk about discernment and a way of thinking about discernment, so that what we are reflecting is God's vision, and that in some sense we have embodied it. But friends, the way that a lot of our leadership was going before was that you all would read a book and say, that's our vision. And you all would come to these kinds of workshops and say, oh, I know what we're supposed to do next. And I got to tell you, friends, the one thing I hope you're not going to get caught up in experiencing is that you'll leave here today knowing what you're supposed to do. If you leave here today knowing what you're supposed to do when you get back home, I will be deeply disappointed. Because it means that you have been sitting here trying to figure out how to solve your problem instead of how to address God's purpose. We got a hand over here.
Well, and that's exactly what the expectation is of the church coming back from the Financial Leadership Academy is, okay, now what have you learned that you are going to be able to solve the problems?
Right. Yep. Expectations are deep here. And the expectations come a lot out of the anxiety of your congregation. They'd like to live a different life. If I might be trite about it, they deeply would like to live a different life as long as they don't have to change the way they live. Well, I mean, no. I mean, I have gone through so many of those linear planning kind of sessions in which, you know, you'd say, what do we really need to do here and what is next? And I can't tell you how many leadership groups I've sat with who wanted more Bible study for other people to go to. So we want to change as long as it doesn't intrude on our sense of preference. One of the tasks of leadership is to help people stop the conversation about preference and start the conversation about purpose.
Can you parse between outcomes and expectations?
Outcomes and expectations. Yeah, hang in with me a little bit if you can, because I actually have a definition of outcomes. And expectations, there's so many ways you can go with this, but one of the things that I do think is that what we are expected to do is to bring comfort to our congregational system. One of the things that Ron Heifetz talks about is that no matter what your leadership is, no one in your congregation will give you leadership beyond the point of their comfort. So in other words, if you're pastor, you can be pastor, that can be your role, you can be a real leader as long as you don't go in a direction that makes people uncomfortable. Okay? Once you have made people uncomfortable, they will turn to you to reestablish comfort. They want you to fix it. And so the expectation is that whatever you bring out of today is going to make it better as long as it doesn't make them uncomfortable. All right? And so one of the things, hang on for a minute, Bern, one of the things that Heifetz points out is that if you actually want things to change, you have to be willing to lead beyond the level of comfort, which puts you in the land of sabotage, which is fine. That's how normative systems happen. I was going to get into this a little bit later, but let's jump into it now because we're right here. Do me a favor, if you would, friends, just put down your papers and pencils and stand and just find one other person to face. You need a partner for our little exercise here. Okay, now, I'm going to, hang on here, friends, I'm going to offer a few instructions. And the first thing we need to do is we need to find out in this pair that the two of you are making, you are already a system, just the two of you together. We have to find out who the leader of that system is. And so we're going to go to the primary learning of leadership studies that have happened over the last 75 years in which there is only one trait that the American people continue to believe shapes a leader. Anybody want to guess what that trait is? Height. We are hang on. I can tell already that some of you are too quickly proud. But what the leadership research has said is that men and women lead equally. They're equally good at it. Introverts and extroverts are equal in terms of their ability to lead. Visionaries and pragmatics, all if it matches the needs of the system. But the American public, despite all the research, still believes that tall people can see things nobody else can see.
Actually,
So, well, work with me, Mark, okay? So,
I would say that the American public believes that men lead better than women.
I didn't say the American public, I'm saying the research.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, as a woman in leadership, I feel like
Agreed,
that there are many times that
agreed.
we don't need to talk about that now. But I just.
But apparently we are talking about it. Okay, so.
yes, Gil.
Yes, we are.
Okay, all right. So, the taller of the two of you is the newly appointed United Methodist pastor to this congregation that the two of you are going to make up. Now, you need to understand your role. Your role is that you are very, very pleased with this appointment. As a matter of fact, you're a little bit surprised by the the sensitivity and the discernment of the appointment cabinet, that they could see that your gifts and graces are going to be the and you are really, really glad to be in this appointment because you've done your homework. You've gone to the conference journals for the last 30 years. You've looked at the numbers. You've talked to everybody who knows anything about this congregation. You've gone to the parsonage at night and you've walked around and looked in the windows. I mean, this is a good place to be. And you're eager to get started because this place has so much potential. It is just dripping with potential. Now, you're a little bit surprised that they haven't done more. But you're not worried because you know as soon as you get there, this thing's going to take off. You okay? You got your role? Okay, the non-tall person. You have been a member of this congregation for 30 years. You have been on the governing board for 25 years. And you know how it works. We okay so far? Okay. This is a nonverbal exercise. I would like you simply to take your hands and place your hands on the hands of your partner. Okay? And you who are the newly appointed United Methodist pastor, I would like you simply to express some of the potential that you see in that. Okay. Now, hang on. Is anybody noticing any resistance? If there's resistance, it's probably because you haven't been clear enough about the potential. Be a little clearer. Come on back. Come on back. Come on back. Now, how long did it take you to figure out that there was resistance in that system? Okay. Now, in terms of systems theory, the issue here, the question was how long did it take you to figure out there was resistance? And the resistance was already, in terms of systems theory, the resistance was already in the system before you began to push. Yes. It is resident in the system. All living, vital systems seek the point of equilibrium, which is the safest place at which it can live. You and I are living systems. We have an internal temperature of 98.6. On a really, really hot day, our temperature starts to go up. We perspire. Evaporation on the skin cools the blood in the capillaries, goes back into the system cooler and brings our temperature down. On a really cold day, what do? We shiver. And the muscle excitement speeds the blood up and warms the system up so it can live at its safe, comfortable place. If you allow that system to get out of control too fast, it is a deep threat. How are we doing? We okay so far? Yes. So essentially what we're talking about here is that if you as a leader come up with the next answer and go back and you try to install it, we would expect that your system is going to push back. And we also know that if you push and then you push harder and you push harder, eventually the system will push you out because you have become a threat when what you wanted to offer was a vision. This is really, and I appreciate the question over here because this is so different from what the church knows about discernment. The other thing I'd like you to at least acknowledge is that when your system is pushing back, it is not opposition. It's information. If you're able to look at resistance as information instead of opposition, that you will know the conversation you need to have with people, because resistance is all about fear. People are telling you what they're afraid they're going to lose. Why would they want to stop you if there wasn't a sense of loss about what was going to happen? So if you're able and you have a willingness to talk about their fear of what might be lost, you'll find that resistance quite often turns into conversation. We had a question here.
I was going to say, my experience has been that my churches are willing to do almost whatever I ask them to do, but it's because they don't expect that I'll be there very long. So
Yeah, the comment was that
I guess there's a comfort that, well, it can go back to the way it was before.
right. Yeah, I don't know if you heard the comment, but you know, people will allow your leadership, if you will, because they know that you're only going to be here for a certain period of time, and we'll go on from there. And if you know of churches that think about their clergy that way, can I introduce you to annual conferences that think about your bishops that way? Or did you not want to have that conversation? It is hard. It is hard to sustain purposeful conversations when leadership changes. It just is. Because, and we'll get into that later, that the new leader has to learn the system before they can lead it anyhow. And so this is very difficult work. And so that comes back to the two issues. We don't really have outcomes. We've learned to live only with aspirations, because as long as you stay aspirational, no one gets threatened. We don't have outcomes because we don't want to take those hard steps. Yes?
You're using a lot of family systems language, yes?
No, but I'm using general systems.
Okay.
And the difference is that you'll find that I will not be as sensitive to people's feelings as family systems.
Why don't think family systems is sensitive?
No, it is. It's very sensitive to the emotional system. All I'm talking about now are just the general systems approach.
Okay.
But that's a minor point. You were going to go
I think so,
someplace with this.
But I guess, Mary Kay is nodding because she and I study family systems work. And I guess this is resonating with me because I have found that to be very helpful for me to manage my own anxiety, to be able to lead through stuff and manage my own anxiety, and when resistance comes to do exactly what you just said, but I learned it through family systems work. And I don't find it to be about feelings at all, but to be about outcome.
Yeah, okay, but let me at least correct the idea that it's not necessarily always about feelings, but it is about emotion and it is about relationship.
It is about relationship. You're right. You're right. It is about relationship. But I in the church, I guess I've found it to be more about where's the outcome that we need to be.
Well, and there's two parts of this for me.
I'm not trying to argue with you. I'm
That's
just saying
fine.
that what I've learned is resonating.
But I want to pursue this. This is the fun of being with a group, that I've got a whole conversation planned, and we might get to it. But
I don't want to do that.
No. You're tracking exactly right. There's two parts to it. We all have different approaches, different styles, different character. I already told you I'm an INTJ. Everything happens in my mind. I'm making jokes about feelings. When I left Albany, they gave me a T-shirt that they thought indicated or kind of reflected my leadership. And my T-shirt said, "Just because I understand doesn't mean I care." All right? That's an INTJ. And some of you are ENFPs. I care even if I don't understand. Okay? So we're going to come at this in different ways. However, let's go back to general systems again. One of the truisms about organizations is that they are all built on two pillars. One is purpose and the other is relationship. And so one of the issues here is that we're talking about getting as clear as possible about purpose, your outcome. And in fact, the other part of the other opposite pole is relationship. But any vital organization has to be clear about what its purpose is. You have to know what product you're trying to produce. You have to know what service you're trying to provide. You have to get very clear about the difference you're trying to make with your products and services. And then what you do is you build your team around it. You clarify your purpose, and then you deal with the relationships. If you go into the bookstore and you look at the shelves of business books on there, there continues to be a whole host of books about visioning, only to be bettered by the next shelf that has more books on team building. Because this is organizations trying to learn how to deal with their primary pillars. How are we doing? We okay so far? Yeah. Okay. Same is true with the church. However, the church, the established church, remember we talked about the established church yesterday that didn't have to be clear about its purpose because everybody was trying to be like it? Please say you remember that.
Yes, Gil.
That meant that we allowed ourselves to get over-relational because we stopped asking about our purpose. And some of you are now in congregations that are so relational that they think that pleasant relationships are the purpose of a congregation. Friends, we have mistakenly defined community as agreement. Do you hear it? And so this is why we're getting into those issues about resistance as early on as we are, because if you will, friends, I am encouraging you to shift the pendulum in your church and push it toward purpose. I want to encourage you to identify what are the next steps that you actually have to put on the ground that will bring you to a closer expression of what you believe you've been called to. And when you do that, you will bump into assumptions about relationship. And you will be rewarded. Negatively rewarded. And this is why courage is now, actually when I'm working with the bishops, particularly in South Central jurisdiction, we are actively talking about courage as being a leadership skill. And we have defined clergy as a willingness to lead without regard for reward. And they are making appointments for which they are not being personally rewarded because they are fully purposeful appointments. It's a very unsettled system. When you do that back in your own congregation, you will get resistance. People are going to tell you what they're afraid they're going to lose. And you need to be willing to have that conversation.
So I'm trying to figure out why relationships and purpose seem to be mutually exclusive. So for me, I'm all about relationships, building relationships in the church. That does make an empowered disciples for Jesus Christ. It's invitational and welcoming. People want to be a part of a community where relationships are good. They don't want to be a part of a community where relationships are not good or restrained. So why doesn't one serve as the catalyst for the other?
Thank you. That's a really helpful way of clarifying what we're after here. These are not opposites. They are a polarity. And let me just spend a minute on that. A polarity is one in which two equal truths exist, but they cannot be complementary. So, should your congregation be a relationally healthy place so that people, kind of deepen their own lives and have fellowship and can support? Absolutely, that is a good. Should your congregation have clear purpose so that you know exactly what you're trying to do in terms of changing the lives of these people in your community? Absolutely. But you see, you can't be fully purposeful and honor relationships. And you can't honor only relationships and have any purpose. So both have to be present. And when the literature talks about polarity, it's always in terms of how do you manage a polarity. And so what happens is that whenever you drift too far to one side as an organization, leadership has to be able to recognize, no, we've gone too far, we have to compensate. All I'm trying to suggest right now, friends, is that we in the United Methodist Church, in the mainline church in the United States, we have been having a conversation about relationship for so long that it's time for leaders to push the pendulum toward purpose. So these are not opposites by any means, but they are deeply connected.
My sense is that many of us are in appointments. When we took the appointment, the purpose of the church, whether it was spoken or not, was to stay open. And the relationships were really, really broken. And so we spent a couple of years anyway, I did, trying to help people not to yell at each other at council meetings or to yell at their pastor. And then it was, so once I could do that, then it was like, okay, so now can we have a different purpose other than, getting along and not yelling at people. Now let's, develop a purpose. So it feels like sometimes, I think as pastors, that we are leading or working with other leaders to be in one of those places, and then when something is so broken that you're spending a place in one, and then when you get to a healthier place, you can move back and forth.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, and sometimes it feels like you're just putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, really, the purpose is, I'm going to get you to stop yelling at me.
I hate to come to this point because after such a deep felt, kind of sentiment, all I can say is, yep. Yep. But I mean, isn't that the case?
Yes. Yeah.
By being appointed to the place where you are, your task as a leader is to learn that system sufficiently so that you then can diagnose what needs to be worked on next.
Right.
And let's give up the fallacy that we are all moving toward making disciples and changing the world. And I don't mean that in an offhand way. There are a lot of you out here who are doing tremendous things in terms of making disciples and transforming your community and the larger world. I don't argue with that at all. But friends, I'm talking about the values of the system in which we live that is asking of us something very different today.
Can you
Joe.
help me out? What's the difference then between what you're calling an aspiration and a purpose?
Well, what I'd like to do, Joe, is to move between an aspiration and an outcome, because an outcome is an expression of the purpose. And so part of what I've been saying all along is that we really don't have outcomes. And notice how I just used Joe to move ahead. But you need to pursue something first.
I was going to say about when we're at the relationship end of the polarity, I think one unspoken thing that often happens, we value relationships with each other whom we already know so highly that there's no room for relationships with others.
Right, right. And that is part of that group think. But don't forget, friends, also that the church has learned to use relationships as a primary reward system. Okay, Bern?
Question on one of an author that I like is John Maxwell. He says leadership is influence. And I'm wondering about if there's a contrast or if there's a conflict between positional authority and the Methodist connection versus developing influence and impacting your system.
Yeah.
Is there a role for positional authority in
Yeah.
the pastorate?
There is a role for positional authority. Positional authority often comes by the terms of your leadership, and in our case, it's the Book of Discipline. You have a position that you have been given that gives you authority. I'm going to say, friends, that because of this polarity, if the only thing you try to use is positional authority and you don't use the relational authority, you are dead in the water faster than you thought. Okay? And let me suggest that positional authority is not a good place to start and often a difficult place to fall back to. Okay? And primarily because everybody will give you authority up to the point of discomfort. And then positional authority disappears. And do you notice how we haven't gotten to Joe's helping us move ahead yet?
Come on, Joe.
We're ready.
Yeah, all right. So, what I want to get at here is talking a little bit about this issue about aspirations and outcomes, not really as much as purpose. Because the outcome for me is a clearer way to talk about, the on-the-ground stuff that we really have to work on. Let me offer what has become kind of a standard for the conversations that I have been doing over the past 10 years or more right now, and it's a very simple model that comes from Edwards Deming. And Deming was the fellow who was the consultant that was called in by Japanese manufacturing after the Second World War. When manufacturing in Japan had been destroyed, they needed to rebuild the manufacturing industry. They called in Deming. He came in and helped them not rebuild, but transform. And so prior to the Second World War, Japan, in terms of its manufacturing, was highly regarded for the amount of junk that it could produce. And it was just an awful lot of things that were of poor quality and often little use. After the Second World War, when they rebuilt the industry, they became leaders in technology and have maintained that position since. And so what I'm saying is that they didn't have Deming come in and simply say, let's build what we had before. They came in and they asked questions about purpose. Why are we doing it? What are we trying to produce? And the simple model that he used is up here, a very simple systems model. You can take a look at any organization, no matter how complex, and you can break it down into 3 basic component parts: input, throughput, and output. That which goes in the system, which are your resources. Those are nouns. The throughput is the activity of the system. This is what you do with your resources. And so these are verbs. And the outcome is the difference you're trying to make. We got it so far? It's a very simple model. But a couple of things let me point out is that if the only thing you're talking about is your input and throughput, then in fact your orientation is on the present moment and sometimes even the past. What resources have you amassed? What do you have available? But if you're talking about outcomes, you're talking about the future. What is it that you're trying to make different? If you're talking about the input and the throughput, the argument is there in the book on doing the math of mission. These are the countables, these are the quantifiables. The reason we count them is because we know how. And so we tend to count how many members do you have, you know, what's your average attendance, all those things that are very countable. And did you hear what just happened? We suddenly started to talk about your membership and your participation, not as outcome, but as resources and activities. Don't forget, I was trained to make members. I was told members were an outcome. No. Members are actually a resource for what the Church of God could do with the people who are gathered in Christ's name. This is going to challenge us to rethink the way we even look at our congregations and how we try to lead them. And so the essential piece here is, that if you're talking about resources and activities, Reggie McNeil said that the benchmark for the mainline church right now is how many, how often, and how much. Those are all quantifiables, and we measure them without end. But when you begin to talk about the outcome, the difference you're trying to make, you have to change the metric. And again, this is argued in the book. You're no longer counting, now you're measuring. You're not asking how many, how often, and how much. You're asking how far. If we've set that as the difference we're trying to make, how far have we moved toward making that difference? It's a different kind of a conversation. How are we doing? We okay so far? Okay. Well, what's that?
You gonna change out parochial reports?
No, I'm not. As a matter of fact, one of the things about that is we're all frustrated by our statistical reports. Do you know that in some of the conferences I work with, clergy have to go on the conference webpage every single Monday morning and put in your membership and your average attendance and your data week by week by week by week. I would argue that may be a little oversensitive. But I will never argue that you shouldn't do it. Because until you know what resources you have available, until you know what activities you're capable of, you have no baseline from which to plan any other change. I can't tell you, and this was something that Alice Mann and I discovered early on with our work with planning, that as congregations grow, they can tell you to the person how many people walked in that door. And if somebody went in and forgot something in the car and came back a second time, Boom, count. And once the congregation plateaus or begins to shrink, suddenly the ushers can't find the book to log their count anymore. If you don't know your fundamental stats, you cannot have a conversation about, can we move further than this, because you don't know where the this is. So yeah, these are insensitive measures. They're not what the church needs to learn how to do, but we know how to do it and we need it, so would you please stop complaining? It's just one of the things we have to do in order to be a church, in order to be an organization, in order to be an institution. But my argument is that we don't have a clear sense of the outcomes, and in fact, that is a nonprofit dilemma. One of the things that you'll find in the literature about nonprofits is nonprofits routinely do not know what they're trying to produce. They are fundamentally aspirational. Peter Drucker has said that the outcome of all nonprofits is the improved human being. Well, that's actually legitimate. You know, the outcome of the American Cancer Society is the obliteration of cancer. That is an aspiration that will make people's lives better. But if that's all they have, they don't know how to go at it. Most nonprofits do not have a clear outcome, and that really does stand very, very directly in terms of what I know about church systems. And then Jim Collins has pointed out that whenever a system doesn't know what its outcome is, it measures its resources and activities. If you don't know what difference you're trying to make and can't measure that, what are you going to measure? Well, you're going to measure your resources and activities. And we default. How many of you have had conversations in your congregation about, do we have enough members? Have you had that conversation? Nobody? Yeah, come on, friends. How many of you had that conversation about, do we have enough money? How many of you had the conversation about, do we have enough young people in our youth group? Okay? I mean, those are all conversations about resources and activities. And we are terribly sensitive to them. But don't forget, if that's the only thing we're talking about, we tend to be talking about our past or our present, not about our future. And the other part about that is that conversations about resources and activities tend always to lead us to conversations about scarcity. We end up talking about what we don't have rather than talking about what we're called to do. How we doing? We okay? Okay, I've been working up here for a long time, friends. Take about 5, 6, 7 minutes right now and just visit with each other around the table. What does your congregation talk about when you're with it? And then we'll get back to questions later. So what are the conversations like in your congregation? What do you tend to focus on? If you would, please.